Corruption and economic crime faced by African citizens, governments, and business community in general are complex and multifaceted, requiring fundamental and systemic changes. In this bonbon, we will discuss what practical measures and structures should be implemented to combat fraud and corruption. What can we learn from experience in African countries, either through their successes or progress that they have made, or through the lessons they have learned? Today, I'm speaking to Mr. Nick Harris. Good morning, Nick. From what I understand, you have been engaged as a forensic accountant in the combating of fraud and corruption in a number of African and Middle Eastern countries for nearly 2 decades. Could you kindly start by first introducing yourself to us?
Cool. No, thank you very much, Albert, and I appreciate the time today. I'm a chartered accountant by trade, but decided that mainstream accounting is very boring, so decided to go into the fraud side. Started off my career at KPMG Advisory Services, doing a couple of years over there in terms of investigations locally and both in some of the African continent. I then went on to be the head of group forensics for MTN, trying to manage and investigate fraud and corruption across 21/22 countries. And then, just recently joined as the head of CIB Pan-African Fraud Strategy for ABSA, which is ABSA Corporate Investment Bank. I've certainly been around on the continent. I've got some interesting tales to tell, and thank you.
Yes, Nick, forensic accountants are often named the James Bonds of accounting. Are there any interesting experiences that you can perhaps share with us regarding corruption you've encountered, and specifically what you may have learned from such experiences?
Yeah, no, thanks, Albert. Yeah, good question. I like being compared to James Bond. I think sometimes people think we are the James Bonds until they actually get into the work and you realize it's James Bond, but with an auditing background. But anyway, so I mean, lots of experiences. I won't bore you today with all of them. The one that really stands out for me is that I was in Liberia in Monrovia, just around 2010, 2011. So literally about 5 years after the Civil War had officially ended. And when I travel, I like to go see the country, hire a taxi, and I don't want to stay in my hotel and tell the guys, let's go look at this beach and so forth. So traveling around Monrovia, and we went. Apparently, there's a beautiful beach and a little bit of a hill where you got like a landmark and you can see out over the sea. So I jumped in the car and went to go see this place, very nice and so forth. But on the way back, suddenly out of the bush, and it's very thick jungle there, jumped 5 guys out with AK-47s, and there's nothing shown that they are, I don't know, police authorities. So I'm standing there, I'm like, I don't know what on earth is going on. These look like Liberian rebels. Guy stops the car, I'm in the back, and they said, well, they're the police and this is a roadblock. And we're like, okay, this is great. And then the guy looked at me immediately and says, yeah, it's $100 to get through the roadblock. And I was like, that's probably the quickest $100 bills ever jumped out of my wallet. And I suppose that's the lesson learned, is that, Africa is definitely one for the unexpected. And, some of the situations you do find yourself in, sometimes it's life of a limb, right? To try and negotiate and pull out your ethics book and say, sorry, I can't pay bribes for you. Even though if you're not a law enforcement officer, it's not going to work in that situation, right? So you're going to do, you definitely have to look after yourself and make sure for that. And I suppose that's the message today, is that there's definitely a practicality when it comes to trying to implement, Western style ethics and systems within the African continent.
So I agree with that, Nick. The thing is, it's very easy to sit in a developed country and think out ethical rules and how things are supposed to work. But if you're confronted with being poor, having a lot of challenges, no access to services, then it's something completely different. And that's what we're doing in this Bonbon series, is thinking from an African perspective and finding African solutions. Now, the fact is, corruption is not only an African problem. The latest Transparency International Index actually paints a grim picture for corruption worldwide. it says that more than for the past 10 years, most countries has made no progress, in terms of combating corruption. But however, the Sub-Saharan African countries, and we have to be honest about it, is still performing the worst of all the regions in the world. And that's the good news, and that's where I want to focus. Certain African countries are performing quite well. For instance, the Seychelles has been consistently performing very well. The same goes for Botswana, Cabo Verde. There's also a couple of African countries that has made significant improvement, and that is where I want to focus, because it shows that something has changed or changing. One of them is Cote d'Ivoire and Ethiopia. Have you had exposure to any of these countries? Are there anything that you've noticed that you can say this is what changed in that particular country?
No, thanks, Albert. Yes, I mean, there's definitely hope. I think places like Mauritius, Seychelles, like you said, Cabo Verde, they are smaller sort of countries, a lot more tourism based and so forth. So, when you don't have large infrastructure bills, the corruption normally follows with that isn't taking place. So, but certainly, I think countries that we can learn from is something like a Botswana or a Cote d'Ivoire. So I've traveled extensively to both of those, and also been following news quite interesting on Ethiopia. And I think what's made the change there is really the leadership. And the problem is that, particularly from an African country perspective, and a lot of the context around is that, if you don't get the leadership right and you don't cascade those set of ethics down into all branches of government, whether it's national or local, you sort of fighting and losing battle, because corruption cascades as well. We all know that. So I see my boss doing that. It's part of the perks of the job and so forth, and I'm going to be doing that as well. So if you can get a really good, strong tone from the top, and you start making it very clear that it's it's no longer tolerated, and you actually fire and you enforce a couple of high-level government officials, corruption sometimes disappears overnight, at least for a while you got that zero tolerance stance. When you go to Botswana, most people, you go out there, South Africa, the road up to Botswana, you get stopped by, a traffic officer. I don't know what's happening, but I'm sure there's lots of bribes going on. As soon as you cross the border, you don't do that. And why is that? Because, if you offer even, a 10 pillar note kind of thing, that officer is probably going to lock you up. And that's how you start enforcing it downwards. Africa is very much about that leadership style. And countries that's where, you've got a very strong tone from the top. And like, I know you haven't mentioned it, but Rwanda is a very good example as well, where, the president together with the cabinet takes a really strong stance against it. And in fact, if you're found guilty of corruption, it's probably one of the worst things in those countries, and you get locked up for a number of years. And you really put a stop to it. So yeah, I think there is a positive note to your point, and the change really starts coming in terms of that will to change in terms of those countries.
Certainly, I agree with that. It actually fits in with something I want to reach. Also speak about, that is the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, of which South Africa and a number of African countries are signatories, which places a lot of emphasis on preventative measures on corruption. The political will, as you said, is certainly one of those. But as a specialist in fraud risk management, you also focus on the prevention of fraud and corruption. Could you maybe explain to what extent you are making use of such procedures in order to combat the scourge of corruption in Africa? And are there any specific challenges that you are facing in that regard?
Yeah, thanks, Albert. Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest defense you can have, particularly in a preventative program, is the education and awareness. Particularly for staff, and if you're a multinational operator in this country, I mean, often you're going to be targeted first by officials looking to extract value, because you are a large operator. There's cash within the organization, and where you're a telco or bank, you're going to be exposed to the same type of risk. the issue there is that, can you actually train your employees in terms of what it actually looks like in that environment? What are the warning signs? If somebody approaches you, what are they going to be asking for? Um, South Africa, we always talk about the cool drink that's been offered, right? What's that corruption language in that country, and how do you translate that to? And what I find very effective is scenario-based training. So actually going into something that's relevant for the organization. You're not taking or copy and pasting some great, UN, guidebook. It's actually something that's tangible for that environment. And then really showing people like, well, maybe you shouldn't be putting yourself in a situation. Should you be climbing into a taxi like I did and drive around Monrovia? It's maybe not a great idea. Maybe if I've been educated before on that, maybe I would have been like, yeah, maybe I'll put myself in harm's way kind of thing. How do you handle it? Simple things. You get to, and this has happened to me on several occasions, you get to passport control, you're in a foreign country, it's a francophone country, they speak in French, and then something, oh, your visa's invalid, you now need to pay another, whatever, 50 euros. And how do you handle that situation? What happens if they say you don't have a yellow fever card and those kind of things? But it goes a little bit further, you start looking at, how do I conduct business? Who am I conducting business through? There's various channels within those countries that you're obviously leveraging off, and often it is about a political connection or somebody who's got that connection within the country that you've now identified as a potential third party. Do you know who you're doing business with? Are they not a front for the ruling party or politically exposed people and so forth? So, you got to take a lot more holistic approach. The first and foremost for me is getting that education, getting people aware of what the scenarios are, and then looking at what are the safeguards and mechanisms in place to make sure that you do actually then mitigate those risks. And then, the big one for me is definitely that third party introducer consultancy risk. And there's lots of these guys on the ground that you'll go through to, and everybody promising the world, and you're trying to deal with this really weird lawyer setup, and you're like, why are they doing the business for me? Those are kind of red flags you got to try to work through and get to a point where you're like, actually, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, and maybe I need to find something a little bit more reputable and so forth.
Thank you, Nick. In the business school, we are obviously focusing on creating business opportunities, providing training in that regard, identifying potential. But what practical advice do you have for entrepreneurs or potential investors even who wish to grow their business in Africa, specifically from the perspective of the risk of fraud and corruption?
Yeah, thanks, Albert. And yeah, I think the biggest risk, particularly for startups and for entrepreneurs going to the various countries, is trying to establish that local presence, right? And sometimes it's very tempting to take a shortcut, because you may be introduced to someone who knows this one, whose aunt or uncle is the president, and they're like, well, for a fee we can get you in and so forth. And I've actually spoken to people in airport lounges and so forth once they find out what I'm doing. And there's horror stories about people paying out hundreds of thousands of dollars to some entity, and then it's actually a scam. People have actually made away with the money, and then they're like, oh my gosh, I don't even get the business. It sounds terrible, but anyway. So yeah, I mean, understanding how do I establish an effective local business? How do I get into the doing I mentioned previously the due diligence portions, the third parties where I'm working through. How do I get for example, access to the right contacts and resources in the correct manner. There's always a networking manner and genuine sense from a lot of people within the governments within those environments that want to establish business, trying to grow business in a legitimate fashion and not through illegitimate fashion. And trying to identify who are those people that I need to deal with, and who are the people I need to stay away from. And then you got to recognize as well is that particularly when you get into countries, the basic controls, right? Control of stock, control of your cash, and so forth. There's a lot of schemes within those countries. It's unfortunately targeting sometimes foreign-owned businesses, but sometimes targeting those local businesses as well. That and those of us general scams and schemes, change in banking details, and all sorts of things. So really coming back to the base hygiene factors. Good control, good command and control principles. good controls around your cash flow and so forth. And in particular, the cash disbursements, and it links back to fraud and it links back to the corruption side, is that, how's cash going out the business, and is it going for legitimate purposes?
Thank you so much. It was very nice listening to you, and we trust that we can have another opportunity in the near future. I think there's a lot that we can learn from practical experience in Africa. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Albert. Appreciate the time, and thank you for inviting me onto the series.